Well, welcome everybody. I am happy to be here with you, and I have a lovely guest, Alix Sugarman. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brianna McWilliam, and I'm an author, educator, and licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. And I help adults struggling with insecure attachment go from self-doubting to self-sovereign so they can call in those soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And I'm very excited to welcome Alix here today because she is going to be talking to us about trauma and its impact on our intimate relationships. Now, I'm going to give you a proper introduction. Alix here is a thought leader in the realm of cutting-edge trauma treatment. As a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist herself and master practitioner in accelerated resolution therapy, she specializes in helping trauma survivors overcome images and physical sensations associated with adverse experiences. She has spent over a decade studying and offering experiential approaches to mental health treatment. Her approach is rooted in the belief that we have a tremendous capacity to heal ourselves through learning and practicing a mind-body approach to healing. It's her belief that the most profound barriers in our healing are typically the cornerstones through which we discover our own resilience. Welcome. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about all of this, so I'm so ready to dive in.
Yes, I love that. And the mind-body approach, this is very synchronistic with my audience and the things that they like to hear and talk about. And that's probably where I would dive in is in your, expert opinion and or in your own words. I mentioned that we're going to be talking about trauma. So how would you define trauma? How do we, that's a big word and it's thrown around a lot. And I'm just wondering if we could break that down a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful starting point because it is a big word and we are throwing it around a ton, and we want to understand what we really mean by that. And I think, look, there is just new research emerging all the time. So whether you're a mental health practitioner or you're consuming it, ultimately it's changing as we learn more. So we need to sort of define and redefine and be willing to shift our thinking about these sort of things. But I usually like to just sort of reference some of my favorite writers or authors and the way that they describe trauma. And sometimes you will hear folks kind of refer to a watershed moment or a before and after. An acute traumatic episode is one in which our perception of safety is threatened. And that word perception is really key because we have, a diagnostic statistic manual that will define trauma, quote unquote. When I was in graduate school, we could list out specific things that were definitely traumatic, a car accident or an assault, but the reality is that we're talking about, at its core, the perception of danger. Mm. And the place that we perceive danger in our bodies is our nervous system, which is really way different than, in our mind. It's way different even than in our body at large. It's a really specific place. And and the more I dive into the newer research and the more excited I get about it, the more I love to explain trauma really just in settling into our nervous system and understanding whether or not we are in a regulated or dysregulated place more often. And so that's a little bit of a complicated word. I just want to simplify it. What that means is, do we have control over our feelings or do they control us? Do we have the capacity to engage with an intense physical sensation, thought, feeling, or does it overwhelm us to the point of kind of taking over? And when we start there, we get to really expand the definition and stop trying to sort of categorize what is inherently a subjective experience. Your trauma is different than my trauma. Your experience in your car, this morning might feel to your nervous system very overwhelming, or it might feel very tolerable. And so we all need to be able to sort of to allow for those really nuanced individual differences. And that is really exciting, I think.
Well, I love the way that you explain that, because it is very relevant to a question I get a lot in my online communities, and that is, how can I determine the difference between, let's say, my nervous system being overwhelmed, or a gut intuition, right? Like, I meet someone, I get the butterflies in my stomach. Are all butterflies bad? Does that mean that in order for me to have a stable relationship, I have to give up that good feeling that I associate with the butterflies, because it means that down the line, it's always going to end up in a push-pull relationship, right? So I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love that question. It's so complicated. I mean, we should just pull up some tea and we could have 2 to 3 hours on this one. It's great.
I've made a career out of this one.
Yeah, totally. Like, where do we start here? But, and particularly with that word intuition, I know that your methodology often kind of intersects with spirituality. And when I think of intuition, I want to go there immediately, but really intuition often is rooted in our nervous system. I mean, those physical sensations, our gut feelings, are related to what's called a dorsal experience of life threat. And that's sort of a more complicated process, which I'll outline a little bit later. But to get back to your question, I think about when we start to tune into physical sensation, what we're managing really is, first of all, immediate perception and something called neuroception, which means that our body is listening at all times beyond awareness. And it's actually filtering information inside our bodies, outside our bodies, and between two people. And so all of that information ultimately is going to indicate something in our gut, likely in our chest, in our bodies, and help us make sense of a really kind of clear concept. If I can oversimplify this, it is really about this continuum from safety to connection. Mm-hmm. And we move along that continuum every single day, and we visit different places in our nervous system every single day. Mm-hmm. But when we experience threat, we move from connection to protection. And so that sort of begs the question of, kind of on this spectrum, asking sort of if butterflies are bad, I kind of roughly translate that through the nervous system in sort of like, is protection bad? Is it bad if I sort of go into a relationship and I feel in my body a desire to protect? Mm-hmm. When we look at things through a neurobiological lens, we don't have to go into this bad or good. Mm-hmm. What we can do is say, is this anchored in a protective response or a connected response? Mm-hmm. When we move from there, and I get like chills when I talk about this, because I love just how clear it is. Mm-hmm. Biologically. Mm-hmm. So when we move into that place of really tuning into how our bodies process safety and protection, safety and protection, and connection and threat, kind of those themes and how they show up in our nervous system, we can make more sense of these physical sensations and understand sort of where they're coming from.
I love that. And that's usually, whenever I get this question, it's very similar to my thoughts about it, is that it's information, and it's asking you to pause and consider what's the context and where is it coming from. And a metaphor I use for this is, if you hear people shouting, we shout when we're excited, and we also shout when we're mad, right? And they're very different contexts. But if you don't speak the language of someone and you just hear them shouting, you might assume that it's all bad, or you might shy away, or you might misinterpret the situation. So it's about learning the language of the body and our felt experiences, and what those sensations mean and where they come from is a way of building that vocabulary, so that when your body starts shouting, then you have a clearer sense of, is this excitement or is this protection, right? Mm-hmm. Is this connection or protection, like you were saying? Mm-hmm. Because I I wouldn't want people to give up all their butterflies. Some of the joy of life, right?
Definitely, definitely. And so one way that we also kind of tune into this when we talk about the nervous system is to think about mobilization and immobilization. So either a flood or a drain of energy. And again, when we talk about energy in that way, we can imagine how that can be really effective, can be really useful, but can also be an indicator of, okay, do we need to move away from this? What is this perception of threat really that's happening? Is it threat, or is it just energy? Because both of those can border each other, as we know.
And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, it's kind of a two-part question. In a previous conversation that we had, we had talked a little bit about the perception of it needing to take like a lifetime to work through a trauma response, or to work through energy, maybe that's kind of stuck on repeat. And you had said, no, it can take a far less than that. And so I wanted to maybe have you kind of restate that and talk about, why it is that you think that. And then also perhaps how then do we quell the nervous system? How then do we, when we are in a triggered state, or anticipate that? What are the tools and or things that we should be aware of surrounding that circumstance?
Yeah, so these are, I'm like, okay, how do we distill it down today? But they're exciting questions. And where do we start? I think that where I like to land today in 2020 is that there are profoundly effective emerging treatment modalities that are dealing with things that didn't exist 5, 10, 15 years ago. I mean, as therapists, we're just learning constantly, and we get to discover these things and discover kind of how they impact people on a daily basis, which is thrilling. So there are ways now. So let me actually start here. When you referenced earlier sort of this experience of hearing people shouting, what we also want to turn to there is an environmental understanding, meaning that the environment is activating our nervous system somehow within that. And then our history is informing that perception. So person A, who grew up with no shouting and doesn't find that to be sort of a threatening experience at all, might just have some real curiosity about that. Oh, voices are raised. I didn't hear that very often in my childhood or in my experiences. Let's like take a look. I'm comfortable over here. I wonder what's happening over there. But if we have a history where, raised voices really brought us into a threatened place, the memory of that experience then obviously informs our current experience. And that's really, really critical, right? Because we're dealing with a nervous system that inherently is not very discerning. What's happening internally is a really old system that doesn't have a lot of updates. It just says safety threat, safety threat, safety threat. And then do I need to get out of here? Do I need to approach this or avoid this? And so what we can do is actually just learn that inner mechanism. And this is the part that I get so excited about, because just identifying that with such clarity, we all have a nervous system. So even in this conversation, as I'm saying this, you might even just be having this thought of, right, like I know what it feels like when my nervous system says approach or avoid, right? But that awareness of how that breaks down and why that system is at play can make all the difference. And so, and understanding really at its core, I think our biology is a really, really key piece of that. And so depending on the complexity of our history and the extent to which we needed our survival responses, we can change our environment, we can change our relationships, we can change our physiological responses with different somatic approaches. And all of those things can contribute to what I would just name as kind of a more regulated nervous system, a nervous system that is able to not necessarily tune away from what could be potentially threatening, but just return to safety more easily. And that's really the key. What's happening when we are feeling sort of hijacked by a feeling, it's not that that hijacking wasn't important or effective information. It's that we struggle with the amount of time that it takes us to sort of return to a safe place and be able to make effective decisions in relationships.
And in your experience, you have found that that doesn't have to take an inordinately long time. Because I know that you've also worked with veterans and who've struggled with PTSD and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that that stuck with me when we were talking about that, because I know for my audience, a lot of them feel like, oh, if I dig into this, it's going to be a lifelong revisiting of the trauma over and over again, and I don't want to have to deal with that. So do you have any words of hope or or maybe a reframe on that kind of myth that that therapy and working on myself is going to take me years and years and years before I start to see any effect?
Yeah, I mean, what I initially said just here was that their emerging modality is one that I can share with you today. Is called accelerated resolution therapy. And it's an evidence-based approach that in 1 to 4 sessions can reduce 75% of symptoms of PTSD. So that is just a whopper of
That's amazing.
Of evidence. Yeah, it's incredible. But again, I think what we're talking about is really subjective things, right? Like how much clearer and easier this conversation would be if we could just say, okay, we're going to move from an unhealed place to a healed place, and then we do this, right? The data tells us, okay, these are the symptoms that we are qualifying. This is the extent to which we can reduce them. But even with something like that, I think your work intersects with this in an interesting way, because attachment is informed by so many different things. Of course, early relationships, but environments, different kinds of relationships, new and evolving relationships. And so then it's sort of like, okay, how do we quantify our capacity to heal that? Mm-hmm. It's complicated. The most hopeful thing that I can say is the research on polyvagal theory, which I'm just over the moon about and love talking about, love sharing, which is a theory which is different than these evidence-based specific approaches, mm-hmm. that really promotes this belief that the nervous system inherently can heal itself, has these healing properties. And so what I like to reimagine with that is that if we're in the right place, if we start there, we can get so much more work done. So I'm just going to throw one more little just piece of clarity around that, because I think it's important. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about the nervous system, I'm talking about a superhighway that goes from your brain to your body. Mm-hmm. And there are 4 pathways that go from your body to your brain, and only 2 pathways that go from your brain to your body. Mm-hmm. And so when we are in those pathways, we're missing that 80% that helps our body respond to different environmental cues in a different way, and thus move through our feelings in a different way, right? Yeah. So, the most hopeful thing is if we start there, if we start in this information and what's coming through, we don't get as lost in the history or the story. And that is really, really effective for lasting change.
You know, and I really like the way that you described that. And I also really like the way you talked about, it's not that we're necessarily trying to eliminate a founded response to threatening stimulus, but that there's a return to center, that the return to center becomes more easeful or more automatic, right? And that's kind of how I define felt security. You know, I feel that a lot of times we perceive healing as being evidenced by how well we can manage and control and pick the right people so that we set up the environment to be just so that nothing has to stimulate that sensitive nerve, right? And so I call it a double trouble, because that's going to perpetuate the external focus of being hypervigilant, for example, right? Or it's going to perpetuate this kind of energy that keeps us trying to keep things just so, which is sort of a repetition oftentimes of what the attachment threat may have been in our lives. And so just to kind of comment on that, like, I like the way that you describe that, because that is in essence how I also think about felt security. It's about how well you can ride the wave, right? How well do you what is your relationship to your own sensitivity? Can you allow for that to be what it is, and then be gentle and forgiving and flexible with it? And I feel like the more we assume that kind of bird's eye view or observer position, you know, within our consciousness, then all of the energy that gets generated around, I'm so messed up, you know, I'm always going to ruin these relationships, they trigger me no matter what they say, and I feel so bad about it, or you know, or there's and that's even sometimes a more conscious perspective. Sometimes we're not even conscious of it. We're just in the thick of that autonomic response, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to just reflect on that, because I really find resonance with what you're sharing there. And my last question would just be, do you have like a quick guidance or exercise or something for someone, like, let's say they're trying to adopt a more mindful stance, and they want to try to affect a sense of felt security in their inner space. Are there any like techniques, or just like a small thing that they could try to do in their daily lives that might help them?
Absolutely. So, well, and this is perfect because it actually I wanted to reflect on what you just shared, and this question will kind of tie in beautifully. But I think when you talk about felt security, I think a lot of the times when we're feeling triggered, we are focusing so much on resolving those cues of danger, that we struggle to land in a place where we can actively experience safety and connection. And that's not because, I think what happens in so many different therapeutic approaches or in so many different relationships, I actually had a session this week where somebody said, you know, my partner says to me, like, why can't you just be happy? And what we did was we just looked at that through a neurobiological lens and said, look, if your nervous system is giving you a lot of information about how unsafe you are at any given moment, it is a biological imperative to attend to that. You cannot return to safety with all of that flood and all of that information. And I think that's where what you were saying, where a lot of shame comes in, because we talk about this as if these are processes that are more within our control. But in the reality, if you're dysregulated, your nervous system is getting hijacked. So what I love about this, just in my practice and in my approach recently, is I think that right over time, I was absolutely just guilty of that experience of, okay, how do we resolve cues of danger? But growth and healing and strength in relationships is about attending to both safety and danger. And so the simplest practice that I would pass along, and this comes from an incredible theorist who just published 2 books. Her name is Deb Dana. I've been studying with her and I just love her to pieces. She and a somatic experiencing approach, I believe, uses this language as well, but it's called attending to a glimmer in your environment. And so it's really about attending to sort of the opposite of a trigger and actively experiencing a cue of safety regularly. So if you are just getting into the thick of it with your partner, along with really being able to understand where your nervous system is in that moment and what is happening, You can also look in your environment and point to and rest in cues of safety. So your partner might not be that in that moment, but it might be you sitting down with a chair against your back. It might be something really beautiful in the window or in nature. It's not about these gigantic moments that I have managed in some of my crisis work. It's about these tiny, tiny practices of cueing in differently to your environment. And so that would be that's called a glimmer. And so the practice would be to actively notice and record what these glimmers are. So different than, say, a gratitude practice, related, but we're talking about looking at that cue and then feeling that in your body. Like right now, I'm going to feel the chair against my back. And I'm gonna notice those physical sensations for about 20 seconds, and I'm gonna rest there. And then I might try that a few different ways in my environment, depending on where I am.
I love that.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, I love that. A glimmer.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. I know that my audience is going to get so much out of this conversation. I know that I got so much out of this conversation. And I really appreciate your willingness to share with us.
Yeah.
Before we go, I just want to give you an opportunity. If anybody wants to learn more from you, or if you have a presence online, or you have upcoming projects or anything like that, how can they engage with you?
Yeah. So I just started my first foray into Instagram. Brianna is such a wellspring of inspiration for that like lateral shift. So my handle on Instagram is Trauma Remedy, and you could always message me anytime with that. I'm going to be doing some small groups just with some nervous system kind of foundational work. So some psych education. And I am in the process of launching a podcast, actually, which is going to be called Make Art and Feel Better. So the website for that is makeartandfeelbetter.com. The Instagram handle is also Make Art and Feel Better. And my website is sugarmantherapy.com, just like it sounds, Sugarman. And the word therapy.com. You can always contact me through there. There is also a link to a TED Talk and just some really accessible ways to find more information on the approaches I talked about today.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.